Well, the Helsinki Commission will come to order. I want to welcome all of our guests that are here, particularly our three panelists who are our real contact between the legislative and the executive branches of government on the Helsinki Commission. We look forward to their testimony. It's good to be here with Chris Smith, the ranking Republican member of the Helsinki Commission. This is an important hearing for us to talk frankly about where we are with the U.S. participation in OSCE, where our strengths are so that we can build upon those strengths, and where we can really try to correct some of the weaknesses within the OSCE framework. I think it's an appropriate time to talk about that as we approach the milestone 35th anniversary next year of the signing of the Helsinki Final Accords. The ministerial meetings will be coming up in December. We're anxious to know the strategy moving into the ministerial meeting. This is an unusual one in that the chair in office recently changed because of the elections in Greece, as well as the first time that the chair in office next year will be from Central Asia, which is, of course, an interesting development within OSCE and one that adds additional opportunities, we hope, during 2010. We also, of course, understand the importance of OSCE in that it is not only the largest regional or international organization in the world, but it's an organization in which both Russia and the United States have equal membership, which is not typical in most of the regional organizations. And of course, we have so many open issues between the United States and Russia today, giving us, we hope, the opportunity to advance some of those issues through the OSCE framework. There's much to celebrate within the recent accomplishments of the Helsinki Commission. We look back to what we did during the Soviet years with the refuseniks and the release of Soviet Jews, and we bring that to the current problems of the Roma population in much of Europe, and the work that we're doing, developing strategies to end human trafficking. And I want to acknowledge the tremendous leadership of Congressman Chris Smith on that effort. Started within the Helsinki Commission and has now become, I think, the norm among all the countries in OSCE that have a game plan, not only laws, but a strategy to end human trafficking. The Commission played a very key role in that. Today, we are still pushing very hard on election monitoring and the key field missions. And the list goes on and on and on of positive developments within OSCE. And of course, the three representatives in regards to the tolerance agenda. All of these are success stories, and in large part due to the U.S. participation in OSCE through the Helsinki Commission. But there's reason to be concerned today. There's reason for us to take stock as to how we can do things better. There's been backsliding in several of the OSCE states that is very troublesome to us all. There are frozen conflicts that are still frozen, and I think many of us had hoped that we would have made more progress. There's open conflict, for example, between Georgia and Russia, in which the process did not work, and it causes us to rethink as to whether we have the right framework to deal with those types of challenges. And then, of course, we have the bureaucratic issues in Vienna and how decisions are made within the OSCE and how the budgets are developed within OSCE, and the U.S. participation both in Vienna and in the funding of the budget requests that come into us through OSCE or through its different institutions, including ODIHR. I want to just acknowledge the cooperation that we have received from the Obama administration. I particularly want to acknowledge Secretary Clinton's strong interest in OSCE. She's a former member of the Helsinki Commission, and just recently had the opportunity to talk with her concerning the OSCE, and I know that she is focused on the need for an ambassador in Vienna, and we hope to have some news on that shortly. I look forward to the testimony. I look forward to the continued strong relationship between the legislative and executive branches, actually seamless as it relates to the U.S. participation in OSCE. Congressman Smith.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I do want to thank you for convening this very important hearing. We have three very distinguished witnesses, which I'm looking forward to hearing from. And I do want to thank you for your leadership on the commission. We've had a robust schedule of hearings. We've, I think, been very active both within the OSCE and the OSCE itself, and it's due in no small measure to your leadership, so I want to commend you for that. Mr. Chairman, with human rights defenders have been profoundly disappointed, and I say this at the outset, with the words and actions of this administration. In only 9 months, President Obama and many of his senior officials have signaled their disinterest in fundamental human rights in countries ranging from China to Cuba, Egypt, and Burma, to Venezuela itself as well. And I raised this issue on human rights. I have tried, Mr. Chairman, for over 20 years to get into Cuba to meet with dissidents there. Although Cuba obviously is not part of the OSCE, I've been denied each and every time. And yet there's this now new opening that we're seeing with this administration vis-a-vis Cuba, and human rights seem to be a distant second or third, even if they're on the plate at all. And I will get into that much further if any of our witnesses would like to engage in that, particularly Mr. Posner. Even the press that has been so supportive of the new president has noted this dramatic demotion of human rights. Mr. Chairman, on this point, I'd like to submit for the record a report and an editorial by Fred Hyatt from the Washington Post that ran just a couple of weeks ago, and the report was a Washington Post report, a human rights activist troubled by the administration's approach, which was done this past May of 2009. Yet, at least within the OSCE region, the administration has not so notably deprioritized human rights. As we are all aware, that our three witnesses have all shown personal commitment to the promotion of human rights. Secretary Posner has dedicated his life to defending many of the most important human rights. Secretary Vershbow has also worked energetically on many of these issues. We are all grateful for him for his work on Jewish immigration from the USSR. And I recall Secretary Gordon's vigorous reaction to the myriad of human rights violations connected to Russia's invasion of Georgia. So I am looking forward to hearing what our witnesses have to say on many issues, particularly U.S. policy towards Belarus and the very important and vexing issue of combating anti-Semitism, which appears to be getting worse. Mr. Chairman, you and I visited Belarus this past July, along with other members of the Commission, and we had, as I think most people know, certainly in this room, had a private meeting with Alexander Lukashenko. Lukashenko was aggressive in that meeting, demanding that our government revoke certain sanctions put on his government by the Belarus Democracy Act, which first became in law back in 2004 and was reauthorized in 2007, and major provisions of it which were adopted into this year's State Department authorization bill. I know from countless meetings with the Belarusian democratic reformers and human rights activists how these sanctions sustain them against the dictator, both materially and morally. And we saw with our own eyes that the sanctions are a big factor in the dictator's thinking. He wants them removed, and so they have to say, if they're going to have them removed, there needs to be substantial progress in the realm of human rights, and they must treat those dissidents with respect and not the scorn that they, and really much worse than scorn, with which Lukashenko and his thugs have done so in the past. Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. I do believe, whether it be election monitoring or human rights, the other baskets obviously are important, but for this commission, human rights has always been first, and Mr. Posner used to head of an organization that was called Human Rights First, and lawyers committed before that. But I thank you again for this hearing.
Thank you, Congressman Smith. Let me welcome our three witnesses, two from the state and one from the fence. Let me just make an observation, and I'm going to introduce our witnesses. Our commission has had a very close relationship with the Department of State, and we want to thank you for that. There's been consistent briefings from both our commission trips as well as from the State Department visits to countries of interest, and we very much appreciate that close working relationship that exists on a day-to-day basis between our staffs and ourselves, and I just really want to get that on the record. Let me introduce Dr. Philip Gordon, who serves as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Prior to assuming his position, he was the Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He served as Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council under President Clinton. Michael Posner serves as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Prior to his current position, he was the executive director and then president of the Human Rights First. Before joining Human Rights First, Mr. Posner practiced law in Chicago. Ambassador Alexander Varshval serves as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. A career Foreign Service officer, he served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO, the Russian Federation, and the Republic of Korea. He's held numerous senior-level foreign policy positions, principally focused on the former Soviet Union and the Balkans. We'll start off with Dr. Gordon.
Chairman Carton, thank you very much for having us here. Mr. Smith, it's nice to see you both again. I agree with the chairman that this is an important hearing to talk frankly about where we are on these issues. And with your permission, I'll make just a short opening statement. Obviously, I've submitted longer testimony for the record. The OSCE remains one of the top 3 key European institutions with which the United States engages, alongside the European Union and NATO. The OSCE remains an essential venue for dialogue, cooperation, and democracy promotion, precisely with those countries that are not yet members of or do not intend to become members of those 2 other organizations. The OSCE's comprehensive approach to security offers a vehicle for engagement across the political, military, economic, and human rights dimensions. That it is a process, and that such a process takes time, does not lessen its importance or the necessity for sustained United States engagement. The Helsinki Final Act says that promoting democracy and respect for human rights is fundamental to achieving sustainable security in Europe and Eurasia. It links security among states to respect for human rights within states. Indeed, I think that's one of the most important features of the OSCE, is that it recognizes that security is not just about what happens between states or beyond borders, but what happens within them. The OSCE's core values are among the reasons this organization has a central role to play in advancing President Obama and Secretary Clinton's foreign policy strategy. Indeed, the remarkable success of the organization during many of the past 35 years is proof of what the participating states can achieve when we implement commitments based on shared values and objectives. Improvements in the lives of our citizens in the OSCE area are the result of hard work, conviction, and persistence. And I would really like to thank the Helsinki Commission members and staff for working so closely together with us in this endeavor. We very much appreciate the institutional knowledge on the Commission and its staff and its dedication to human rights and the energy that they bring to our joint efforts. The Helsinki Final Act has long stood as a beacon for the silenced, the disenfranchised, and the displaced. The OSCE is among the most effective and cost-effective international organizations working on human dimension issues today. It is well known for its election monitoring expertise, its efforts to promote basic freedoms and human rights, including religious freedom and freedom of the media, association, and assembly, and for its groundbreaking work in combating anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance. The OSCE's 18 field operations play a key role in promoting democracy and developing sustainable institutions. We look forward to Secretary Clinton's participation in the Athens Ministerial in December. As the chairman said, the secretary is a very strong proponent of the OSCE, and she's going to go to Athens in December to make our views on the organization clear. We'll work to revitalize the OSCE's contributions in each of the 3 dimensions of security. The Corfu process, inaugurated by the Greek OSCE Chair in Office to take a fresh look at the OSCE itself and European security more generally, is at the center of the revitalization effort. We hope OSCE participating states will not only renew their commitment to the OSCE's core values at Athens, but also to begin to chart its future in engaging new and old security challenges as Kazakhstan takes over as the organization's, as was pointed out, first ever Central Asian Chair in Office. I will just very briefly summarize a couple of points from my written testimony in the following areas. The human dimension. The OSCE's human dimension activities are what help set the organization apart from other organizations. We fully support these activities and will continue to push for greater implementation of the commitments of all participating states have made to each other and to their citizens. The political military dimension. Arms control and confidence building measures remain a foundation of the long-term security of the OSCE region. Russia's decision to suspend its implementation of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe in December 2007 has raised serious concerns among its CFE partners and within the OSCE as a whole. The OSCE plays a central role in our efforts to find peaceful solutions to the protracted conflicts within the OSCE region. The United States is a Minsk Group co-chair working to make progress in Nagorno-Karabakh, We're an observer in the 5+2 mechanism set up to address the Transnistrian conflict, and we are engaged on a constant basis in efforts to build a stable and secure future for Georgia. I'll also elaborate Georgia in what I hope will be our discussion. Economic and environmental dimension is also important. The OSCE has been a catalyst for regional cooperation on a broad array of economic and environmental activities, including transparency, good governance, water resource management, migration assistance, and the disposal of hazardous waste. Afghanistan. We greatly appreciate the OSCE's recent efforts within Afghanistan, such as the recent ODIHR election support team mission deployed for Afghanistan's August presidential and provincial council elections. Kazakhstan as the OSCE chairman in office. Just a brief word about that before I conclude. I think it's another issue we'll want to explore in this hearing. The United States stands ready to assist Kazakhstan in its goal of a successful term as chair in office. It is critical that the chair of the OSCE meet the high standards of democracy and fundamental human rights upon which the OSCE is based. We continue to have intensive discussions with the government of Kazakhstan to encourage authorities to implement democratic reforms in line with their Madrid commitments. In conclusion, I'll just say that the OSCE's multidimensional approach to security is directly relevant to the many transnational issues we face as we work together to build a democratic, prosperous, and secure transatlantic community. Again, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith, thank you so much for holding this hearing, and I will look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Secretary Posner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you both for your long commitment to these issues and to human rights issues in particular. Congressman Smith, you and I have worked over a number of years on issues as diverse as Northern Ireland, Russia, China, anti-Semitism, refugee protection. And the hearings you held over the years on Northern Ireland made a huge difference and led us to the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, which your scrutiny really helped provoke. So I thank you for that. And Chairman Cardin, I just couldn't be more thrilled that you're the chair of this body, and I look forward to becoming a commissioner and working with you. I would like my written statement just to be put into the record, and I want to just highlight a few main points.
Without objection, each of your written statements.
When President Obama addressed the General Assembly last month, he reiterated a call for a new era of U.S. engagement in the world. And at HDIM and at OSCE, our engagement is guided by three principal tenets. One is engagement. I think we've gone to the HDIM in Warsaw in the spirit of engagement, but also recognizing the importance of standing for our values. We will strenuously resist efforts that undermine OSCE principles or weaken the office of democratic institutions and human rights, the field missions, or other human dimension efforts. And those debates are underway. The second tenet of our approach is universality. We are dedicated to upholding consistent principles that are reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, starting with ourselves. And I think the President's executive orders, his second day in office, announcing a determination to close Guantanamo, to end abusive interrogations, and to review security detention policies are emblematic of that commitment. At HDIM, I joined a delegation headed by Dr. Michael Altzel in exchanging views with states, and we made every effort to respond to those concerns expressed about the U.S. record and emphasized that we do not consider such expressions to be interference in our internal affairs. That sends an important signal, and hopefully one that other governments will follow. The third tenet of our approach at OSCE and elsewhere is telling the truth. We went and had bilateral discussions with a number of governments, including the Russians, including the governments of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and others. And we had frank discussion, sharing of views. In the weeks even since the meeting, more troubling developments have occurred, and those are the kinds of things we need to monitor. Independent election monitors reported irregularities during the municipal elections that took place in Russia, October 11th. Such irregularities undermine prospects for accountable democratic governance. We're especially concerned by the continuing pressures and violence against members of the NGO Memorial in Russia, a group which I've worked with personally for decades, which has just been awarded the Sakharov Prize by the European Parliament. During her Moscow visit, Secretary Clinton expressed support for President Medvedev's statements about more open society, but she also met with civil society activists. And she underscored that the United States stands with those who work for freedom, campaign for justice and democracy, and who risk their lives to speak out for human rights. In Russia, people literally do risk their lives to speak out for human rights. In Uzbekistan, despite some relatively promising developments last year towards curbing child labor in the cotton sector, the government again this year has mobilized children to take part in this year's harvest. That's an issue we're attentive to and we need to be pushing back. We're concerned about the October 20th arrest in Turkmenistan of a civil society activist, Andrei Zatoka. We urge the government of Turkmenistan to ensure that he gets due process and humane treatment. The circumstances surrounding his arrest are troubling given the history of his 2006 arrest, and they reinforce fears in the human rights community there. The list goes on, and I have more instances in my testimony. I think we are prepared as we look, and I want to share Assistant Secretary Gordon's comments about Kazakhstan. We are ready to work with the government of Kazakhstan, but we've also called on them to show leadership by example and to make steady progress toward meeting all of their Madrid commitments, including reducing criminal liability for defamation. We're deeply concerned about an appellate court decision October 20th upholding a conviction and a 4-year prison sentence against human rights advocate Yevgeny Zavadas. We urge Kazakhstan to pursue the upcoming procedural review of his case in accordance with Kazakhstan law and its commitment to international justice standards. At HDM, I also made a special point of meeting with NGOs. This is a major theme for President Obama and Secretary Clinton. The subject has special resonance for me because of my years working in the NGO world, and it's one of the strengths of the OSCE process. But I think we need to be attentive to efforts by a number of governments to curtail NGO activism and participation at OSCE and fight those efforts as strenuously as we can. I look forward to working with you. I thank you for holding this hearing, and I stand ready to answer your questions.
We do look forward to you being on this side of the table. Secretary Vashbel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to be here and to be with Congressman Smith as well. And thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and its contributions to a Europe whole, free, and at peace. With the Athens Ministerial coming up in December, this hearing is a very good opportunity to step back and think about some of the accomplishments that the organization has had over the past 4.5 decades, but also what we'd like to see in the future. Since the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, the OSCE has played an historic role in helping Europe to transition from a period of protracted conflict to a time of increasing prosperity, freedom, and stability. It has offered objective election observer missions across Europe, including in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Moldova. It served as a mediator in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and has stood, at least for a brief time, as an agent of peace and stability on Georgia's administrative boundary lines with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. As someone who cares a great deal about the security and freedom of the transatlantic community, I've always valued the important role that the OSCE has played in promoting the vision of its 35 founding states that was expressed nearly 3.5 decades ago. And I recall my first time appearing before this commission when there was still the Soviet Union, and the world has moved on considerably, and the OSCE played an important part. Now, since today I'm representing the Department of Defense, I'll focus on a few concrete areas of the OSCE's success in the defense and security realm before going into some issues that we would like to see addressed as we go forward. Like my colleagues, I have a longer statement, which I've submitted for the record. I'll just touch upon some of the highlights. Recent OSCE security sector achievements include helping states to better control weapons of mass destruction, reducing small arms trafficking, engaging with Mediterranean states, and taking a proactive approach to cybersecurity threats. First, weapons of mass destruction. WMD acquisition and use by those who mean us harm presents an existential threat to OSCE members. The organization has taken some pragmatic steps to help states better implement UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which obliges all UN member states to enforce WMD counterproliferation measures. OSCE will be publishing a best practice guide on proven and effective means of implementing Resolution 1540, and the United States is cooperating with other OSCE member states on further work on 1540 to give its implementation a stronger focus within the organization. Second, OSCE has implemented initiatives to mitigate the threats posed by small arms and light weapons transfers. It's programs to eliminate deteriorating liquid rocket fuel in Armenia and Georgia, to reduce small arms and ammunition in Tajikistan and Belarus, and to decrease the number of man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, in Cyprus, have all contributed to regional security and stability. Third, I'd like to mention our dialogue with Mediterranean states on important security issues. The OSCE's partnership has served as a useful forum. Over the past year, the United States has organized seminars in Vienna and in Morocco on the threats to the Mediterranean region posed by MANPADS, and this December's Mediterranean Partners Conference in Cairo will address regional conflict prevention and resolution, as well as migration issues. On cybersecurity, we've seen in Estonia and in Georgia the threats that cyber attacks can pose to the critical infrastructure of our increasingly networked world. The OSCE is tackling this challenge head-on. At a recent cybersecurity workshop, OSCE members and representatives from Egypt, Japan, the Arab League, and NATO, among others, discussed ways to improve cyber defenses worldwide. They agreed to carefully review capacities and deficiencies in national cybersecurity efforts. There are also some areas where we hope to see further progress in the near future. One of these is Afghanistan. As you know, the government of Afghanistan requested OSCE assistance back in 2007. In response, the OSCE Secretariat proposed 16 projects to enhance Afghan border security, including a welcome emphasis on building Afghan capacity. But so far, only a few of these projects have been implemented. We still need OSCE-wide support on 2 projects that we believe are critical and in everyone's interest. A proposed training facility at Sher Khan Bandar and a mentoring and monitoring project at Afghan border crossing points. So we hope to get a full OSCE consensus on these projects soon. Now, as we address emerging challenges, it's also vital that we continue to address the threat of traditional international conflict among sovereign states. As this committee's co-chair stated at the time, Russia's August 2008 invasion of Georgia represented a violation of Georgia's territorial integrity and Principle 4 of the Helsinki Final Act. We regret the end of the OSCE and UN missions in Georgia and the lack of access to the separatist regions, which impedes efforts to reduce tensions and prevent incidents from spinning out of control. The OSCE offers a particularly important forum for engagement because, as last year's August events show, we have to make existing mechanisms more effective in preventing conflicts. We remain ready to continue our dialogue with Russia in the OSCE about its ideas for a new European security architecture, although we are committed to working through existing structures and mechanisms for joint cooperation on European security rather than creating new ones. We also look forward to continuing our close cooperation with Russia and our other fellow Minsk Group co-chair France to support the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan as they finalize the basic principles for settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The most vital of the OSCE's security mechanisms are the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, CFE, the Vienna Document 1999, and the Open Skies Treaty. remain very concerned about Russia's suspension of its legal obligations under CFE and continue to urge that they return to full implementation as soon as possible. The Vienna document is a complementary confidence and security building mechanism that remains a successful transparency mechanism. We hope all parties will continue to maintain the transparency that remains its core principle. Open skies allows each state party the right to observe any part of the territory of other parties, a truly historic step in transparency by all 34 states parties. Significant challenges lie ahead, however, and we'll continue to seek agreement to preserve the benefits of this landmark treaty. So, Mr. Chairman, more than 35 years ago, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe began negotiations to end the Cold War and create foundations for a safe, prosperous, and free continent, with its crowning achievement being the Helsinki Final Act. The peaceful conclusion of the Cold War and the triumph of Helsinki principles represent a remarkable achievement, and the Helsinki process, aided by this Commission, remains an extraordinary example of the exercise of the collective will to prevent war and to consolidate freedom and democracy. OSCE member states can be proud of their achievements, but we haven't fully secured the foundations of peace and security in Europe, nor have we fully realized our vision of transparency, openness, and predictability in military affairs. So we look forward to working with the OSCE and with this Commission to realize the full potential of this organization and to achieve the goal of a Europe both free and at peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony. Let me acknowledge Dr. Mike Hutzel, who is here from a very successful head of our mission to the Human Dimensions implementation meetings in Warsaw. We got a report back, and we know that you were very active, and we thank you very much for your leadership in that regard. We were joined by Senator Brownback, the senior Republican on the Commission from the Senate and one of the leading advocates for human rights in the United States Senate. Senator Brownback, please make an opening statement.
Hi. Thank you very much, Senator Cardin, but I don't have one. I am pleased to join the hearing and to hear the testimony. I've got a few questions. Seems to be a pretty propitious time right now for us in Europe and how we engage, so I've got some questions on that line.
Let me just first start off by saying that the Commission was recently in Athens and met with Prime Minister Papandreou, and he had heard from Secretary Clinton and was very excited that Secretary Clinton will be attending the ministerial meetings in Athens in December. Let me follow up, though, on one point. Look, I think this administration is focused on human rights. I think it's focused on all three of the baskets in OSCE, the security basket, the economic environmental front, where we're going to be dealing with global climate change, also within OSCE, and the human rights front. And I must tell you, the announcement by the Obama administration to close Guantanamo Bay and the changing of the interrogation procedures was extremely well received internationally. It was certainly the right way to proceed. I just want to underscore, though, that in the highly visible international visits, human rights has not been in the spotlight. And I think that's an issue that needs to be corrected and addressed. And I mention that as a friend. Let me just give you one potential opportunity. We've all talked about Kazakhstan taking on the chair in office in December. They've been working very closely with our Commission. They've been working very closely with our government to try to be as prepared as possible to take on the challenges. Secretary Gordon, you mentioned the fact that they must use the high standards of OSCE. We expect that from them. They have done some good things, but there are some issues that are outstanding that at this point we thought would have been addressed by now and have not been addressed, and we've been very open about talking about it. They are talking about the possibility of having a summit of OSCE. I would hope the position of the Obama administration would be that there should be no summit just for taking photographs, but if we can use the U.S. participation to advance the OSCE agenda on all three baskets, but particularly focused on the human rights issues with Kazakhstan as chair in office, that presents an opportunity that I think could really underscore the priorities of our nation and our participation within the OSCE. So I mention that to you as I think we need to focus this better, and I say it as a person who really wants to work with the administration in that regard.
Could I, Mr. Chairman, respond on a couple of those important issues? First, on highlighting human rights and what the administration does, and Assistant Secretary Posner may want to weigh in. Let me just say, in the part of the world that I deal with, of course we can always do more, and we should, but on the recent visits to Russia, I think both the President and the Secretary did put human rights and democracy front and center. The President spoke about it not just privately in his meetings with all of the top Russian leaders, but publicly in his speech at the New Economic School, and in his very visible meeting with human rights groups, NGOs, and opposition figures, and in his interview with Novaya Gazeta, one of the more prominent liberal voices. And the Secretary did the same thing, meeting at Spaza House with civil society and NGO and human rights activists, doing an interview on Echo Moskvy, again underscoring the importance of independent media. And I'd like to quote from what she said, which I think it really is at the core of what the administration feels on this issue. Secretary Clinton in Moscow said that a society cannot be truly open when those who stand up and speak out are murdered, and people cannot trust the rule of law when killers act with impunity. She made that very clear, again, both publicly and privately. And she told those who speak out that the United States stands firmly by their side, and I wanted that to be underscored. As for Kazakhstan, we couldn't agree more. As I noted in my testimony, the agreement to allow Kazakhstan to hold the chairmanship came with certain responsibilities and certain agreements on their part. And they are now in the international spotlight. And I encourage you, as you suggested you would, to keep this spotlight on them and insist that they uphold their agreements. That was part of the logic of doing this, is to encourage them to make those commitments. And now we need to see that they're upheld. And the world will be watching, and just as you will hold them to that standard, so will we. And then finally, on the issue of a summit, again, if I might, I would say, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's about substance. If a summit can accomplish something, including in the core areas of the OSCE, including human rights, then there should be a summit. But we're not interested in having a summit just to allow somebody to have a summit or to go and waste anybody's time. So again, the process is linked to the substance. If there's something that can be achieved in the important areas of the OSCE, let's do it. And if not, we won't do it.
Thank you. Secretary Posner?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think we need to be, in the case of Kazakhstan, particularly attentive to the restrictions they place on advocates, on the use of the criminal liability for defamation. The case I mentioned, the Zaradas case, I think is emblematic of that problem. The fact that weeks after the HDIM, the appellate court upheld the conviction, I think, is not a good sign. And we need to be pushing back. Congress and this commission ought to do it, and we, the administration, need to do it. We met with them in Warsaw. We were very clear about our concerns about that. I think it is exactly when we say uphold the Madrid commitments, this is what we're talking about. So I think we have an opportunity now in Athens and then going forward to say we really, a notion of having a summit is really dependent on making sure that you live up to the expectations as a leader in this process.
Thank you. Secretary Pashwell, I was representing the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly at the meetings in Corfu, where Russia had brought forward the prospects of a new security arrangement for Europe. There was, I think, almost total consensus, maybe at -1, Russia, that strengthening the existing organizations, including OSCE, was the preferred way to proceed. Has there been any follow-up since the Corfu meetings on the specific suggestions brought forward by Russia? Has the United States taken any position with our allies in order to further the discussions that took place in Corfu?
Secretary Gordon can comment on this too. There have been some discussions in the OSCE at the permanent representative level in Vienna. But I think we're still at a very early stage of this dialogue. But I do think the consensus that among, as you said, all but perhaps one, or maybe one or two, of the member states, that the focus should be on improving the existing network of institutions rather than trying to invent new ones is the way to go. And I think that we remain still a little unclear as to what precisely the Russians are driving at. I think that they clearly feel that the institutions have not necessarily given Russia the voice, the influence that it wants on European security. But of course, we can point to the Russian departure from some of the Helsinki principles as having led to some of the problems, not least the conflict in Georgia. So we certainly want to work with them, because we certainly want to find a better way to prevent conflict, to de-escalate tensions in still volatile regions like the Caucasus. There's still problems in the Balkans where OSCE, I think, contribute. So we approach this with a constructive spirit, but with the sense that in terms of the structures themselves, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Secretary Ford?
Yeah, if I could just add, Mr. Chairman, as you witnessed in Corfu, we were quite clear what we thought about this idea of a European Security Treaty, which is we are always happy to engage with the Russians or any other partners on European security and to talk about ways in which things could be improved. Sure, things can be improved. We just had a war in the summer of 2008. So we don't want to shut off dialogue, and we remain open to discussion. As for whether we need new principles and institutions, we are, as we made clear in Corfu, quite skeptical. Indeed, one of the ironies of the Russian proposal is that it draws attention to the utility of the OSCE, because it is an organization that's comprehensive, there's 56 members, everyone in Europe and Eurasia is a part of it, and it's based on some pretty sound principles, those in the Helsinki Final Act. And that's what we have consistently said to the Russians. Why don't we work on strengthening this organization that we have, which is very good, and why don't we work on implementing the principles that we have agreed to, which are very important, rather than talking about setting up new institutions or new principles or a new treaty that would be very difficult in any case to enforce. So that has been our consistent line. We've continued to engage with them in the OSCE and in the Corfu process. We remain always ready to look at other ideas to strengthen European security. As for their insistence that more be done on hard security, we have two responses. One is, let us not overlook so-called soft security and the human dimension, which we don't want to get away from. And that's why we want to come back to the OSCE. And as for hard security, we can talk more about it. There is the CFE treaty already, which they have suspended, and we would encourage them to come back into compliance and cooperation.
Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, I think we're talking to the choir here, three individuals who care deeply about human rights and democracy. But I would just, and echo what the chairman said, and I said in my statement as well, there is concern among many of us who, and I've been in Congress now 29 years. My first trip on behalf of human rights was with the National Conference on Soviet Jewry, and Mark Levin, I believe, is here. He usually is here. He's here. There he is. For a 10-day stint in Moscow and Leningrad pushing for refuseniks. And, the concern is that, and Mr. Posner, your post was left painfully unfilled, I should say, for far too many months. The ambassador or the director of the Global Anti-Semitism Review Act, the office that was created by that, and I would note parenthetically, I was the prime House sponsor of that and offered the amendment to make it permanent and to have a person in that position to promote or to combat anti-Semitism to the best of his or her ability. That remains unfilled. The ambassador at large for religious freedom, to the best of my knowledge, still remains unfulfilled. And the distinguished Senator Mr. Brownback from Kansas and I and Frank Wolf worked a decade ago to establish that. And so it sends a message to many of us that human rights are a talking point, but not central and fully integrated, and certainly is not first in the dialogue. I had a meeting, and I say this, and I hope you'll bring this back. Harry Wu is one of my closest dissident friends. I meet with him all the time. When he was being held after going back into China, I actually held a hearing to call for his release. Did everything I possibly could, and was joined by a whole lot of other people doing the same thing. Harry Wu was in my office 3 weeks ago, and I've never seen this before with Harry Wu. He's probably the toughest guy you'll ever meet. He had tears in his eyes, and he said, the Obama administration, he got all worked up, doesn't care about human rights. I said, Harry, please calm down. And he had tears in his eyes. And I don't think we should take that and just, look askance and say, here is a man who was paid with his blood, close to 20 years in the Laogai system, actually went back and took great risks, was rearrested at the border, we'll all remember, and just eats, sleeps, and breathes human rights. And when Mrs. Clinton made her trip on her way to Beijing and said, we will not allow human rights to interfere, her words, not mine, with global climate change, and I support the administration on global climate change, voted for the bill in the House, so there's no disagreement there, not at the expense of human rights, and certainly not to sell our treasury bills to finance a debt that is truly unsustainable. Human rights all of a sudden becomes under the table. I know it won't be that way with you, Mr. Posner, Secretary Posner, because I know you believe it so passionately, but I'm worried about the administration's approach, especially on the eve of a trip to China, which will have repercussions, I should say, in the Caucasus and throughout the OSCE, because what happens in Beijing will be heard around the world, not just throughout all of the PRC. So those open positions, fill them. We need, acting are fine at religious freedom, ambassador at large, but we need a point person, and we need it now, and we need it at the anti-Semitism office as well. So please, take that back. I don't care what administration is in. When Bush was in, when Clinton was in, when Bush 1 was in, I'm the one who with David Bonnier and Dick Gephardt, held press conferences lauding President Clinton in his first year when he linked human rights with MFN, only to find out it was a false promise and he ripped it up. And then went into complaint mode. But believe me, this is a nonpartisan issue as far as I'm concerned, and human rights have to be first and always first, and sadly I don't think they are. Secondly, I'd like to raise, and if you want to comment on that in a second, I would appreciate it if you would. On Belarus, our chairman led us to Minsk. We had an excellent meeting. We had more than a dozen members in a face-off, friendly but firm with Lukashenko. And I know, scored, I think on the 14th of August, you met with Lukashenko as well. I believe that was the date, whatever the date was.
I didn't actually meet with Lukashenko. I met with others.
Okay. But it seemed as if he wants to obviously see a reversal or an amelioration of those sanctions. My hope is not until we have real deeds and not promises or even minor deeds. We need some substantial deeds from this man. And again, that's the message we heard from our friends in the dissident community, if you can speak to that. Thirdly, on, if I could, today we marked up a bill on Afghanistan authored by the chairman of the committee and the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Berman and Ileana Ross-Layton, which I'm not sure how it's being looked at by the administration, but I know there's frustration among both sides of the aisle about our policies vis-a-vis Iran. And one of the things that seems to be missing is human rights there. And Mr. Brownback has had hearings in this commission repeatedly on Iranian human rights and democracy building. And I'm wondering if you might want to speak, especially with Russia's, obviously, an OSCE meeting member, what you see we should be doing vis-a-vis in the OSCE with regards to Iran and Russia. I read Pravda every day. I probably shouldn't admit to that. I read People's Daily every day as well, online, of course, and in English. The saber rattling towards Ukraine and Georgia seems to be growing. There's a crescendo there of animosity reflected in the newspapers. It's also coming out of the mouths of some of the politicians, if you can speak to that as well. Because all of us are concerned about new eruptions, if you will, in South Ossetia especially.
Can I lead off just on the points that you made at the outset? If you were frustrated by my not being in the position, I can assure you I was with you. It was 7 months from the time I had an initial conversation with Secretary Clinton until I took office. And there was no controversy. I was voted by consensus. And so there is something wrong with the process that takes that long. We have somebody identified to be in the anti-Semitism position, an excellent person, who's now going through a less onerous but also exhausting process, and hopefully that person will be in place in a few weeks or certainly within a month. Huh?
Can you announce that here?
No, I can just say that we're in the process, and there will be somebody soon. I want to say to that point, though, and again, this is something you and I have talked about. I think we were in Berlin together at the OSCE meeting focused on anti-Semitism, which led to the creation of that special representative. I share your commitment to this entirely, and I share your view that the level of, my concern about the level of anti-Semitic attacks and comments in Europe, in the Middle East, and elsewhere is something of great, great concern. We track these things. We're going to continue to do that. 2 days ago, we rolled out the Religious Freedom Report, which takes a comprehensive view. We were very hard-hitting on a whole range of fronts, including on China, including on a number of countries in the Middle East, including on countries in Europe, like Russia, that still permit too much intolerance against minority religions. This is a big problem, and it's something that we're really committed to working on. In fact, I'm very committed. We've had an Office on Religious Freedom, and we've had a special envoy on anti-Semitism. My view is let's bring everything together and really integrate this within the State Department, take it to the regional bureaus, and say, let's make this a more central piece of the way we do foreign policy. I think these issues are critical, and I stand ready to work with you all to make that happen.
If I might, I'll briefly address the three main points that you made. On the first, you asked us to take a message back, and I certainly will. I already underscored the way in which I think the President and the Secretary, at least in Moscow, drew great and important attention to the human rights issue, but we'll also certainly pass along the perceptions that you raised about the need to do more. And as for these positions, as was discussed, sometimes this process takes too long to get people in place, but we're absolutely committed to doing so. And those positions are important, and they will be filled with the right people. On Belarus, indeed, and I appreciated the opportunity we had to compare notes on this after your trip and before mine. To clarify, I spent some time with the Belarusian leaders, but didn't meet with President Lukashenko. That could happen at some other time, but we felt this time it was appropriate to do business at a different level. And the business was what we discussed, and I think we had very much the same message, which is that, as the administration has mentioned in other cases, we are open to dialogue and engagement. And we have noticed a couple of signs, not nearly enough, but enough from Belarus to merit talking further about this. And I went to Minsk with a very clear message, and I was the most senior official to go to Minsk for 10 years from the State Department. And we wanted them to notice that as well. And the message was that if they want a better relationship with the United States, and certainly if they want any scope for lifting the sanctions that have been put on them, then they need to go about their democracy and human rights practices differently. And that's the core of the issue. There are other things we care about, like getting our embassy fully staffed. We welcome the fact that they released an American citizen, Mr. Zeltser, thanks in part to your good work. We took that as a sign that they might want a different and better relationship, and some other modest steps that they had taken about registering in NGOs and media. But I made clear to them that they still have a very long way to go, and that there was a linkage between the two things. So we'll see what comes of that. I think it was a good thing that you all went. I think it was appropriate for me to go and let them know the different future that could be available if they do different things at home, but also that there won't be a different future if they don't. And we'll see what comes of that. From our point of view, we're going to sustain this approach, but we will need to see results from them before there's a significant change in our policy. We're also, I should add, working very close with the Europeans on this, who I think have a similar approach. They also have sanctions on Belarus. They're also focused on democracy and human rights. And we're more powerful when we work on this together. Because if one of us slips, then we lose the leverage of the entire West pushing them on the issues that we care about. The final point on Russia and the OSCE, I think we have seen, we've talked in other contexts about the reset with Russia and what we're trying to accomplish, and I think honestly there have been signs of progress in areas where we clearly need to do more and see more. We have reached some concrete agreements in some important areas. When the President was there in the summer, the Afghan Lethal Transit Agreement, which allows us to have diversified supply routes to Afghanistan, and can save us a considerable amount of money by being able to cross Russian airspace. It's good for us, it's good for Afghanistan, and it's the type of agreement we can have with Russia where we have common interests and we work together. And there are others in the Bilateral Presidential Commission, hopefully a START agreement. We have some common interests and we've seen some constructive work with Russians and we want to pursue that. At the same time, we have made clear from the start that we have differences, and we don't paper over the differences in order to have the successes in the agreements. And you highlighted some of those differences, and we have underscored them as well, and they include Ukraine and Georgia, as you mentioned. We have a fundamental difference about Georgia and its sovereignty and territorial integrity, which we recognize and will continue to recognize. Fortunately, so does the vast majority of countries in the world. Only Russia and two others have recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and we, with the united international community, don't and won't. We have a real difference on that, and we have a real difference on the implementation of the August 2008 ceasefire agreements and on access for humanitarian groups and NGOs to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And we're very clear with the Russians about that, both within the OSCE and bilaterally. And we have concerns about Ukraine as well and some of the things that have been said recently there. We have differences on NATO enlargement and one of the core principles of European security that we think countries and democracies in Europe should have the right to join alliances of their choosing. And we have differences on human rights, which I already alluded to, that the President and the Secretary both made very clear at Moscow.
If I could just follow on to what Secretary Gordon just said. In response to the question about saber rattling by the Russians, I think that this is an area of concern that we watch very carefully. I was just in Ukraine about 3 weeks ago and in Georgia last week, and one of my purposes was to reassure those two countries who are feeling a little nervous that we do stand by them and we support their sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think part of our common work between the Defense Department and the State Department is to try to help these countries strengthen their own institutions, their political institutions, their economies, which is a key part to their becoming more self-reliant and able to strengthen their own security. But we also support their legitimate right to self-defense and to choose their security alliances. We pledged to assist them as they pursue their NATO aspirations. This is a process that's going to take some years. They have a lot of work to do, but it's something that, as a matter of principle, we stand by them on. The focus of my visits was on strengthening our bilateral defense relations and working on bilateral defense cooperation, helping with their defense reforms. And there too, I think we sometimes are criticized by the Russians, but as a matter of principle, these are sovereign countries that deserve our support, and we're very transparent about it. I think we also do raise these issues, as Phil Gordon just said, in our dialogue with Russia, and I think that as we try to reset our relations with Russia and create more of a mutual stake in cooperation, it hopefully will give the Russians incentives to manage their differences with countries like Ukraine and Georgia, rather than to exacerbate existing tensions. And I think there are means within the OSCE process where we can help as well. Part of the focus of our efforts in the Corfu process is to strengthen all countries' commitment to those very fundamental Helsinki principles, starting with things like sovereignty and territorial integrity, respect for the independence of all states and for their existing borders. We I think, recognize that we could do better in our conflict prevention efforts. We can find better mechanisms to prevent crises as occurred in Georgia from happening again. We should certainly do that. More transparency about military activities, confidence building measures, these are all things that we will pursue to try to contribute to a de-escalation of tensions. And I think encouraging Russia and its neighbors to work together on common security projects, which is another area where the OSCE can be useful. Things like border security, fighting narcotics trafficking, dealing with non-proliferation issues, This also can give them a mutual stake in cooperative relations that can provide longer-term solutions to these problems.
Senator Brownback?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here and for your work. Secretary Bishop, just following up on that about Georgia and the Ukraine, is there, what time frame are you looking at to see their joining NATO? Because that, as a tangible thing, I would think that would be one of the most tangible that we could stand for, push for aggressively and quickly to stand against the saber rattling by the Russians.
Well, I think it's very hard to come up with a timetable at this point. I mean, NATO has taken a very important decision at its Bucharest summit last year in stating that these two countries will be members of NATO. And there are now mechanisms that NATO has established by which both countries have to demonstrate that they are able to meet NATO standards. So in part, this is up to them, whether they prepare to put their shoulder to the wheel and do the necessary preparations, which involves not just military things, but strengthening democratic institutions.
But you could help them with the military things.
We certainly, in a responsible way, because we're trying to maintain stability as we go forward, and we're very transparent about our defense relations, but we do stand ready to be their mentor in this process, even though NATO itself has the mechanisms by which they pursue their aspirations.
So what time frame are you?
I think we're talking about a matter of years, but I wouldn't want to put a number on it because a lot depends on the efforts of Ukraine and Georgia. And also, at the end of the day, there has to be a political decision based on consensus by all the members of NATO as to when they will be admitted.
The sooner, the better, and you're going to be pushing for that? The administration will?
We believe that we should stand by the decisions NATO has made and assist these countries moving as quickly as they're prepared to go. And then NATO will have to make its decision at the appropriate time.
Well, as I understand, I had a Ukrainian official in my office yesterday. They're prepared to go right now, just very quickly. And I really think some strong prodding by the administration and then tangible support would be a key thing in standing up in this pretty aggressive Russian atmosphere right now towards both of those countries.
I think in the case of Ukraine, and this is a subject of my defense consultations when I was there a few weeks ago, that they have a lot of work to do to stay on track for meeting the NATO standards. Their defense budget has declined precipitously. They've missed opportunities this past year to participate in Partnership for Peace exercises because their parliament couldn't pass the necessary legislation. So there are issues on the home front that Ukraine has to tend to, which may be easier to address after their elections early next year. But ultimately, the pace is really more for the candidate members to determine rather than for us. But we, as I said, are openly ready to advise them and assist them. We have FMF for both countries. We have other defense cooperative activities. So we will do our part, but they have the lion's share of the work to do themselves.
Well, if I could submit to you, this could be one of the most tangible positive steps that the administration could really put its shoulder into to help out in this setting, and I would hope you would. So Secretary Pussner, on Iran, we put forward different funds over time for democracy and civil society building in Iran, and at different times we've had various responses from administrations whether or not to use those funds. I think it's one of the most positive things we can do, given the desire from a lot of people in Iran to move forward, to have a bigger say in their own governance. And when we had the various revolutions taking place in Eastern Europe, it seemed to me the ones that took root the most were those that had some civil society platforms built into the countries already. Ukraine was one. Georgia had done a lot in the stands, maybe a lesser standard, but Kyrgyzstan probably done more than others, even though they've all had some difficulties. And yet we're hearing now that they're pulling funds back from State Department's not renewed the grant for the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center at Yale University. And other reports that it seems like we're pulling back from some of these fundings. Now, I hope that's not to try to get concessions from the regime in Iran, but I hope it's not taking place. And if you could shed any light on that, I would appreciate it.
Thank you for asking that, and in fact, I was going to come back on Iran and also say to Congressman Smith, obviously, we share your concern about the long-term systematic repression in Iran. I testified yesterday at the UN General Assembly in the Third Committee about 3 countries, North Korea, Burma, and Iran. And I talked not only about the systematic repression, but the post-election violence, the use of coerced confessions. There is a very serious and very, very troubling situation. I don't know the specific grant you referred to. One of the things I'm looking at, I've been there a month, and one of the things I'm looking at is across the board how we direct funds to civil society, to NGO activists, to independent press, in particular in closed societies. And one of the things that's apparent is that we don't have an embassy in Iran. We don't have an embassy in North Korea. And so the appropriation or the process of figuring out what to fund is usually driven by local diplomats working for the U.S. We don't have that there. And I think we ought, and I'd love to work with members of the Congress to think about setting up a fund that explicitly looks, as we did 20 years ago in Eastern Europe in closed societies, how do we deal with closed societies today and give that kind of support that you're talking about to the people that are fighting from within to try to change things. There are issues, and again, the first response I've gotten from some people is in a place like Iran, there are certain dangers to people inside the country. We have to be careful of how we do it. I accept that, but I think the principle is sacrosanct. We ought to be on the side of those who are challenging these governments from within, and we ought to be looking for creative ways to open up space for them to challenge their own society. So I'm with you on that. I will look into the particular
If you would.
grant you described.
I would appreciate that. And just, it's been a frustration for me that for years we've gotten some funding for civil society and democracy building in Iran, and then a lot of times it doesn't get spent by the administration. And I presume they use the same sort of statement that you have. Well, it's kind of hard to tell because we don't have civilian on the ground, but there are a number of groups working on these topics, and then just that lack of any infrastructure of civil society. Then when you get a moment where change could actually happen, you don't have any fertile soil for the seeds to take root and move forward with. And so I would urge you may have to take some risk in doing that. And then finally, we're close, the Congress is close to appropriating $30 million for global internet freedom programming. Maybe this is for you, I don't know, maybe Cord, but perhaps for Assistant Secretary Posner. During the Iran revolutionary, not the Iran revolution, but the Iran election and the follow-on to that, some very creative folks outside the system set up ways that people could access Twitter and Facebook. And if you look at it, it's almost like with sticks and knives that they whittled this thing together, but they did it. And it gave people a way to communicate. I would hope that these sort of funds, with some others, could open up that internet that could really be just a huge benefit in any of the closed societies around, particularly Iran and China, but other closed societies too. Thanks, Chairman.
We actually have a group in the Democracy, Rights, and Labor Bureau that's looking just at this issue. And I feel very strongly that there are lots of opportunities. I think this is the new activism. As in the 80s, people were trying to keep books out of the Moscow Book Fair, the Russians were. I think we're now looking at a new generation of activists who use Twitter, as they did in Iran, and who use the internet and use new means of communication to talk with each other and to talk with the world. It is in our interest to open up that space. And I'm delighted that Congress is supportive of that. We're equally interested in trying to pursue and push the limits of how to do that.
We've been joined by Congressman. Nice to have you here. I'll give you a moment to catch your breath, and then, as I understand that we're okay till 3:30 when your schedule's on. Make sure we have to work. Let me talk about a couple areas specific. Let's start with Georgia. We did have some discussions about Georgia, but I do want to get your assessment as to how stable things are in Georgia today without having a mission, international mission there, without having access to certain areas. What is the prognosis, and is there any suggestions as to how we could perhaps provide a greater monitoring as to what's happening?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for raising that. The situation in Georgia is clearly unsatisfactory. I don't think we see signs of any imminent conflict reemerging, but it's certainly not time to be complacent given such an unstable situation. We regret, as you point out, that the diverse international monitoring groups that were there are, for the most part, no longer there. The UN is no longer in Abkhazia, and the OSCE is no longer in South Ossetia. We regret that because they were performing an important role of transparency. They were our eyes and ears on the ground. We got to a point where we could no longer, we could not go along with the conditions that the Russians were trying to put on their continued presence, which were, in our view, would have changed the status of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We insisted all along that any UN mission or any OSCE mission be status neutral. They couldn't agree to that, and therefore we and the Georgian government, even more importantly, wouldn't agree, and that led to the departure of the OSCE and the UN missions, which was regrettable. Fortunately, the European Union stepped in and has provided monitors, and right now those are the only eyes and ears on the ground. It is far better than nothing because they're able to independently verify. You sometimes get murky reports about what's happening at checkpoints and what different people are doing with military forces, and it's helpful to have the European Union monitoring mission there, although it's not in all of Georgia, and we continue to believe there need to be independent, international, unbiased monitors throughout the whole country. So that's why I say it's not a satisfactory situation, nor is it satisfactory in terms of access of humanitarian assistance and NGOs to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And we raise this at the highest levels and frequently with Russia, but have yet to get satisfaction in terms of getting those NGOs and humanitarian groups in. We continue to do so. We'll do it again at the OSCE Ministerial in Athens, but we're not satisfied. We also, let me just repeat, believe that Russia needs to fully implement the August and September ceasefires of 2008, which require them to bring their forces back to the positions that they held before August 7th, 2008, and they haven't done that. So we have a lot of work to do. We don't see any imminent threat of military conflict breaking out again, but it can't be excluded, and therefore we have a lot more work to do.
Well, I think our observations are the same here, so it's a little frustrating because we don't, without having the international mission there, it's difficult for us to know whether there are changes taking place, getting objective information about it. Clearly, that's needed. So I hope we'll continue to work on a strategy that can try to cool that circumstances down so that we don't have a threat of open conflict. We've invested a lot in the Balkans, and there's certainly been a lot of positive signs in the Balkans. Many of the countries are emerging much stronger. There are allies in NATO. There are allies in many other areas. There's just strong democracies that are coming out in the Balkans. But there's one country that's backsliding, and that's Bosnia. And I say it openly and with regret. We were in Bosnia not too long ago. And I think we all held out hope that we would be much further along in regards to NATO and in regards to the EU than we are today. And we still, obviously that's our goal, and we're going to continue to focus on that. But quite frankly, there's been concern that the ethnic factions within Bosnia are preventing the type of constitutional reforms that are necessary for Bosnia to make the transition. And troubling to us is that we're not sure there is the will within Europe to firmly stand behind the necessary constitutional reforms before moving to the next step in Bosnia. particularly with the Office of High Representative. So if you could I get your assessment as to where you think we are in Bosnia?
Sure, thank you. We share much of your assessment, certainly about backsliding in Bosnia. And that's in contrast not only to much of Europe overall, where broadly over the 14 years since the Dayton Agreement, we've made significant progress in Central Europe, Northern Europe, and parts of Eastern. But even in parts of the Balkans. Albania and Croatia have joined NATO. Serbia, with which we have some differences over Kosovo, has elected a government that is pro-Western, pro-European Union, cooperative with us. The general trend in the region is, with all the difficulties, countries gradually reforming economically and politically and moving toward the West. Bosnia, as you point out, on the other hand, has stagnated at best or slid backwards at worst. So we certainly share that analysis, which is what motivated us recently to enhance our engagement. You know, I think in the Obama administration there are a lot of people who have great experience and expertise in the Balkans. We went through that during the Clinton administration. Many senior officials, including the gentleman to my left, were very deeply engaged in it at the time, and now are back in office and are very interested in Bosnia and committed to our engagement there. So in recent weeks we recommitted, and we did so, as I'm sure you followed, together with the European Union, and this allowed me to address your point about whether the Europeans are equally committed. We felt that was necessary because ultimately we can only do this together with European partners. Bosnia is in Europe. The greatest motivating factor for many of these countries in the Balkans is their ultimate desire to join the European Union and join the West and Euro-Atlantic institutions. Indeed, one of the few things, frankly, that all Bosnians do agree on is ultimately the desire to be part of Europe, visa-free travel, membership in the European Union, and the prosperity and democracy that comes with it. So we have to do this together with the European partners. And there I would actually say we're very satisfied with the degree to which we see it in the same way and are committed to doing the same things. So Deputy Secretary of State Jim Steinberg, together with Swedish Foreign Minister Carl Bildt in the rotating EU presidency, have been twice together to Sarajevo in the past several weeks to try to make clear to the Bosnians we are ready to help. We've been frank with them, as the Vice President was when he took a trip there last spring, about their backsliding. And we have told them that if they want this future in Europe and in Euro-Atlantic institutions, they need to get over these ethnic and nationalist disputes, and they need at least to get on the starting line towards European integration, and that requires some domestic changes in having a functional government. We don't believe that there can be a massive reform of Bosnia's constitution immediately because the parties aren't ready for it. But to make changes that would allow them to be a candidate for European Union membership, to have a functional government, to deal with the issue of dividing state property, we think we put on the table a very reasonable package that would allow them to do that. And again, Secretary Steinberg and Foreign Minister Bildt have presented that. The parties are considering it. We appreciate the fact that they have all come to these meetings and engaged, even though there are differences. And we're going to continue to work it, because ultimately, as you suggested, we've already invested a lot in Bosnia over the past 15 years and more. And it is in Europe's interest as a whole to have a more stable Bosnia on the path towards Europe.
Well, I'm glad to hear that we're working closely with Europe. There was some concern about that. Congressman Eisen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Poizner, President Obama made a statement, or a series of statements, but one of them was about dictators loosening the clench of their fist. And he was referring in many cases to the countries in the East. That was very reminiscent of Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush. What is different in this administration? How is that going to be accomplished vis-a-vis not just some of the remaining non-democratic states, but also Russia's impact on maintaining some of these strong men?
Congressman, I think the approach of this administration, which is in the long term going to get results, is a combination of a willingness to engage in a principled way, a determination to hold every government to a single universal human rights standard, and a tenacity about telling the truth. So when I met in Warsaw with my Russian counterpart, the conversation was about Natalia Estemirova, the memorial researcher in Chechnya who was killed, and the failure to investigate. It is not for us necessarily the only issue. There are other issues on the agenda, but we're going to continue to be direct and forthright in raising the concerns about civil society, about the ability of people within a society to challenge government actions, and we're going to look for results. It's going to take time, it's going to take energy. It's partly what I'm there to do, but I'm determined to do it in a way that brings in my colleagues who work on these issues day to day in each of the regions, and to do it in a principled but practical way that really affects real people. I can't, we're going to struggle with some of these. I don't have any doubt these are the toughest issues in some cases to take up with a government like Russia. But they've made a commitment in the Estemirova case that they're going to investigate, and I think it's critical that we hold them to that commitment.
Do you believe you'll be holding the Syrian government to that same standard for the assassination of Rafiq Hariri?
Absolutely. It is in our interest, again, to be honest and to hold every government, including ourselves, to a set of standards that are outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's what this is about. And is it easy to do it? No. But it's the only way, I think, to get results.
Secretary Gordon, this is not intended to be a stray, but it'll sound a stray at first. As I look at the Eastern and Western European situation, it seems to be Russian-centric because of Russian oil and natural gas. No surprise. And we have here on the Hill today a large group of EU parliamentarians who are very concerned and very involved in seeing that we live up to a cap and trade agreement. Having said that, it's not the cap and trade agreement I want to talk about. It's if we assume for a moment that Europe dramatically reduces its dependence on carbon-based fuels through any means, it's probably good for their reducing the dependency on Russian carbon products. However, if the United States is competing for those same resources, in other words, if in some cases it's do we get alternate energy or not, and in the case of the Europeans, if Russia is allowed to continue using it as a weapon during the interim to those who need it, isn't in a sense going to simply raise the cost of doing business but not deter the Russians from using it as a weapon? In short, how is it we use cap and trade, global warming, the reduction on carbon fuels, how can we use it as a positive part of creating a situation in which Russia's weapon is less powerful?
Thank you. I think it actually would make a positive contribution to the political side of the energy security equation. Those who are most focused on cap and trade and alternative energy, and no doubt the European parliamentarians you saw, are interested in it primarily for climate change reasons. That's the main thing on their list. But if you're reducing your dependence on carbon, which in Europe's case means imports,
And from Russia for the most part.
Natural gas from Russia, oil from both Russia and other places, then it would have a positive corollary in political and security terms because you'd be less dependent. We have seen that countries that are exceedingly dependent for energy on Russia are naturally, inevitably, at least partly dependent on them politically. So in that sense, the focus on reducing energy imports for reasons of the environment has a positive political corollary from which we would all benefit. We have put great emphasis on European energy security for both of those reasons, but including the one that we believe that countries that are dependent on a single supplier, and this is more true of gas than oil because oil, being fungible, can come from elsewhere, but if you have
At least in some cases.
in some cases, but so if you're dependent on a gas pipeline, you can't just build a new gas pipeline the next day. So we've been very much focused on that and believe. There's not one fix to this problem. As you know, the President and Secretary named Ambassador Dick Morningstar to focus solely on this question of Eurasian energy security, because it is so important to us. We know there's not one fix to this problem. It's not just going to be renewables, it's not going to be diversification, it's not just going to be conservation, but all of those things together will hopefully contribute to the lessening of political dependence of Europeans on Russians.
And then the last question along that line, the previous administration was very supportive of Kazakhstan and other Caspian Sea exports. The idea being that if they exported around Russia, it created a genuine second path. If they exported through Russia, it was actually made it more difficult for us to have an independent relationship with some of the stands, particularly Kazakhstan. Will this administration follow the same tact of finding ways to create those opportunities for oil and also now natural gas to come out of that region?
Diversification is the key to this. We strongly believe in that. It's the corollary to the answer I gave to your first question about dependence. And therefore, alternative sources of energy, be they Caspian, Central Asian, or other, lessen Europe's energy dependence and therefore political dependence on Russia. That's why we've been promoting the Southern Corridor without committing to any particular pipeline or another. The idea that even if the gas and oil comes from Central Asia, if it passes through Russia, then you're still at least in part dependent on Russia. If you have another corridor for gas and oil, then you have alternatives, and that we think has political and economic and energy benefits.
And then for actually any of you that feel comfortable answering it, we who are here look at Russia, Iran, Russia, Eastern and Western Europe. Is there a trade-off? In fact, are we giving up when we push hard to get something from Iran, or on the Iran front? Are we in fact selling out European, if you will, strong pushes, and vice versa? And if so, how do we maximize the ability to do enough just to deter Iran with Russia's help, and at the same time not sell out the efforts for democracy and rule of law in Europe, Eastern Europe?
I'll make a brief comment. I don't know if others will want to weigh in. Obviously, there are always potential challenges and trade-offs in diplomacy. What I would say is that the President has made very clear, certainly where Russia is concerned, that our desire for a better and more constructive relationship with Russia, and even concrete agreements with Russia, will not come at the expense of our principles or our friends. So when we look to sign a START treaty with Russia, or an Afghan lethal transit agreement with Russia, or anything with Russia, we're doing so because we think we have a mutual interest in doing so with Russia. And we don't compromise on important principles that we have about supporting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of our friends in Europe, or their right to choose their alliances, or anything else for that matter.
Thank you, Senator.
Congressman Smith. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just, on Bosnia very briefly, and you may want to comment or not comment, but it seems to me that entity voting remains the reason why the parliament, the legislature in Bosnia is dysfunctional. When a small group, a small claque of people can block virtually everything the parliament does, leaving it all to the high representative. I know that there was a very substantive suggestion made that could have led to, I think, serious reform. And we had our own small states, big states problem at the beginning of this democracy, and we resolved it by having 2 senators and representation by the House to reflect population. And I would hope that the idea that was put forward will be revisited. I know it's been largely rejected thus far, but I think we have an impasse until something along the lines of that idea, which you know very well all about, is resurrected and promoted. And I hope our European friends would buy into it as well. To the best of my knowledge, they have not. But we got to make that parliament functional, or at least encourage it. They've got to do it themselves, of course. On another issue, we had a hearing just a few days ago, several days ago, where the 3 personal representatives from the OSCE on the anti-Christian efforts to combat that, the anti-Muslim and the anti-Semitic, all made very cogent presentations. Rabbi Andy Baker, who is there to combat anti-Semitism, made a very important point that there are a large number of projects that are falling through the cracks because of insufficient funding. One would be the Train the Trainers program, which we initiated back during the Berlin conference. It came in collaboration with the American Jewish Committee here in the United States, and it is an excellent example that with a very small amount of money, huge benefits can be realized. And I would hope that project in particular and others that Rabbi Baker has outlined would be looked at to see if a small amount of money, and we're not talking big change in a capital now that's talking trillions and not even billions anymore, could make an enormous amount of difference in combating anti-Semitism and those other forms of intolerance. So I would ask you if you could take that back.
Absolutely. I also met with Rabbi Baker and one of the other representatives, but we agreed we were going to have a follow-up conversation. I'll take it up.
Thank you.
The record will remain open for written questions. We do appreciate your time and thank you for your input, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. And in Mr. Posner's case, we look forward to you joining us in our workload of this commission. With that, the commission will stand adjourned.